Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek Russian T34 85. Since the last video update, the tank's front idler and rear sprocket have been modified, reworked, and mounted to the model. All of these modifications and improvements that were made to these two components will be discussed in more detail in this video. Picking up from the last point where we left off, and that was at the front idler mount system that we have here. As a quick recap, the idler mount system on the Armortek T34 kit mirrors the other kits made by Armortek, in which the piece is designed, assembled, and also the way it functions. Starting up here, we have the idler shaft, we have the idler yoke, two pivoting pins, two long fasteners, and two CNC'd brass cups. For final assembly, the idler mount gets slid into the tank. The yoke here gets bolted to the piece, thus locking it. The pivoting swinging link gets slid in place. This long fastener threads on the inside portion, and the fastener keeps this piece from drifting left or right. And most importantly, this is what gives you the actual track tension of the tank. Now, to adjust the piece, that's where this little brass cup comes in. This here is a little socket that gets mounted to the front hull, and the fastener's head plugs on the inside like this. Now, like what was seen on the Armortek King Tiger and the Tiger 1, this system does work very well, and is one that is very finely adjusted in that you could really tune in your track tension on these Armortek tanks to get them where they need to be in a very fine manner. The potential problem, however, that this design has, it has to do with the ability for the piece to lose track tension. If for whatever reason the track tension is lost on the model, the idler arm can pivot out of the way, and now we have this loose bit of machinery on the inside, and trying to get this to go back into the cup here can be problematic. Now, this only would be affected if the track ever loses tension, as the only thing that keeps the unit firmly in place is the force of the track tension on the idler mount. As long as there's track tension there, it keeps everything mounted. Again, if you ever pop a track or you break a link or whatever reason, and that tension is no longer there, that's when the swinging issue can occur. Now, on other builds, the way I thwart this is I design a retention system that keeps the head of the fastener nested inside of the cup, and that's precisely what I'm going to do for this build over here. Now, while working on the assembly of the front idler system, I did encounter a procedure that I had to have made to the yoke in order to get it to mount on the inside of the tank. Now, like I said before, the way this component mounts is that we have the idler mount, it slides on, and then it's held in place with that of a fastener. Now, normally this works without any issues and is very easily done. However, because of the shape of the T34's hull, with that high angle or that very pointy nose that it has, there's not a whole lot of internal space in order to slide the fastener and the nut on. Also, when it comes time for actual hinging and linking, the nut head and the fastener bolt do make contact with the interior trunnion that is found on the front. To remedy the situation, I went ahead and modified the unit to the way you see it here. What I went ahead and did was I bored a hole halfway into the material on each side. What this does is that this lowers the profile of the fastener so that it gives you more clearance compared to having the piece stock. Now, even with this done, I still believe I'm going to need to grind away some of the head portion of the fastener in order to get it to slide on and be mounted on the inside portion of the tight confines of the T34. This yoke here has been drilled, and I'm going to give it another shot of primer, and this unit here will also get the same modification made. And here are the yokes with the procedure now completed. They are ready for priming. However, before I take them into prime, I just want to point out that when it comes time to drilling these units out, this is a very risky procedure and should only be done with someone who has the tools and also the experience with working with this type of a material. You can easily over drill into the material, and if you drill this section all the way out, the yoke is basically ruined and you're not going to be able to install it. And this is a very crucial and important component for the RC tank. Now, if in case anyone is wondering if I drilled it out, is the piece still strong enough to support the tank's weight of the track? The answer is yes. This material is very durable, and you'll see that I have at least 2 millimeters of material left behind. This should give me more than enough strength in keeping everything firmly in place. And here are the parts just before installation. Now, in addition to the yokes getting their wells drilled out, I also went ahead and modified the fasteners. For the fasteners, the model utilizes these button head fasteners that we have here. Now, to make the piece even more low profile, I went ahead and turned away some of the material on the shelf portion here of the fastener head. Purpose for this is so that it fits better inside of the wells that were drilled inside of the yoke. Here you can see as a profile, the piece is basically as flush as can be. And then from here, this should give me the clearance required in order to mount the piece to the tank. And here we have the idler mounts now permanently affixed to the tank, as well as on this side here, the idler is completely affixed along with its detail hubcap. As for the idler mount, the system was installed with the modifications that I mentioned before. However, I will point out that even with the modifications, it was still very difficult in order to get everything together, and it does require a bit of time in hand fitting in order to get everything exactly where it needs to be. This here again has really little to do with the actual design of the Armortek component. The pieces are actually designed very well. Has to do with more or less the design of the T34 in itself. As you can see right over here in this area here, there's not a whole lot of real estate on the inside in order just to maneuver components in, even with your hands, let alone trying to get fasteners in their place. However, at the end of the day, I was still able to accomplish the install. And here's the unit, what it looks like on the inside, fully assembled. Like I said before, it is your basic Armortek adjustable idler mount system, only the way it mounts is that the piece is supported at the roof of the vehicle as opposed to the rear wall. Now, the piece is adjusted with that fastener, like I said before, and also, as you can see from here, there is the cup on the top portion here of the idler mount itself. This cup is designed to hold the fastener in place in case track tension is ever lost. You're not going to have to worry about that fastener popping loose on you and moving around on the inside. Now, it is only held onto the tank with adhesives as well as some silicone. However, like I said in the other videos, this component here actually serves no load-bearing function whatsoever. It is purely there just as an insurance policy in case, again, track tension is lost, and the piece just doesn't flop around. Once everything is fitted in place, the installation is complete, and you're now ready for the installation of the actual idler itself. Which, in case the track tension is ever lost, it would be just like the way you see it here in this video. This is the component with the track tension added, and with the track tension removed, it just hangs loose. As you can see, it's contained inside of that little cup over there, and it's not going to, the black fastener is not going to pop off and possibly pivot out of the way, which if it does happen and you don't have that retention cap system, trying to get it lined back up is definitely something that is not going to be the highlight of your day. And on the outside portion, here you can see where the fasteners are adjusted on the exterior portion of the tank. Now, this is actually as true to form to the real T34, as these features are found on the front plate of the actual tank. Now, there are going to be detail caps that go over these two sections here, but of course these are going to be added later on as the build progresses. Now, you'll notice that I did have to widen the holes slightly on each of these sections here on the top portion. This was just due to the way the fasteners were fitted. When it comes time to adjusting them with the wrench, with the extra little bit of material removed, I can actually go in here and tighten the pieces with a lot more ease compared to the stock hole configuration. The same was true to the opposite side as well. As for the mounting of the idler itself, this is done with the exact same procedure and steps that were done with the road wheels. This would include a swipe of grease on the axle, again for reasons of which I've made perfectly clear in several of these build videos. There's no need to repeat them at this point. We then slide on the ball bearing. Add a little bit more grease because the volume was basically wiped away. And then we can mount on the front idler wheel. Now, as we can recall, the idler wheels are side specific and are non-reversible. The way to tell them apart was that on the original Armortek idler, this area here was threaded for that of the hubcap detailing. The wheel simply slides on, and I'm going to add the other ball bearing. And with a few light taps of the rubber mallet, get the wheel seated in place. With the wheel now fitted, it's now time to mount on the retention system. Now I'm going to be using, of course, some blue thread lock on this. Now in the past I've also used red Loctite for this type of procedure. However, this is something I've been trying to change and think about on my builds. The thing is with the red Loctite is that it does hold on to the fastener, to the axle, in a very strong way, and is definitely one that does work. However, the only problem that comes to mind is that in case you ever have to remove the wheel for whatever reason, the blue Loctite will give way before the red Loctite does, which, when it comes time to removal, with the red Loctite, since it bonds so well with the internal threading, you do run the risk of possibly stripping the tool section here on the fastener, which is definitely something that's going to add complications to your repair job. So that's why I've been kind of moving towards blue Loctite for these applications over here. From what I've seen for several of the other recent builds that I've done, the blue Loctite seems to do the same type of job in keeping everything in its place. Blue Loctite, of course, was added, and I'm going to just thread it on. Now I'm going to bottom it out to the point where if you bottom out the fastener, the wheel will become a lot stiffer with its motion, to which then I'm going to slowly back up on the fastener until the component is held on, but it has enough freedom for the wheel to spin freely. This again is a procedure that I've done on several tanks in the past. Just a little turn, spinning a little bit easier, and another slight turn, and there we go. The wheel is now completely free and spins without any hiccups. It is at this point now where I can add the hubcap detailing. As for the hubs, like I said in the last video, I'll be utilizing the EastCoastArmory.com 3D printed T34 idler hubcap set. As for the pieces, they get fixed to the Armortek idler with that of silicone. I simply apply it on the rim. Wipe off any real extra while smearing it evenly on the rim surface. And then I mount it directly to the Armortek idler. And there we go. The idler wheel is now completely finished, and we can now move on to the tank's rear sprockets. With the idlers out of the way, it's now time to focus on the tank's sprockets. This would include both assembly as well as installation. Now, this sprocket that we have here is totally stock, and this sprocket that we have here has been revised. We'll be going over this in more detail in a little bit. As for the stock sprocket, like I may have mentioned in the one of the previous project update videos, the kit supplied sprockets are actually very nice. They are comprised of a solid single piece of CNC'd aluminum that has its detailing, or basic detailing I should say, present. There is a hubcap, which gets mounted to the center, which completes that of the overall face detailing of the piece. The piece is held on with that of a taper brush lock, which is just like all the other Armortek tank kits and is a staple on their tank models. We also have here several CNC'd domed, or I should say coned, fasteners, which of course are used to mount on that of the roller lugs. The roller lugs, by the way, are CNC'd out of solid steel. Now, one thing that's really awesome about the stock T34 kit from Armortek is that the sprocket works in the exact same way as it would on the real T34. And by that, as I mean with the T34 sprocket design. The T34 was very unique in that the sprocket had an internal type tooth assembly, rather than all the other tanks either of the period or ever since, in which their sprockets are that of an external geared ring that get mounted to a center hub and lock, of course, into cutouts in the track castings. The T34 did not have any of that. The sprocket would have engaged the track via these round lugs that we would have here mounted in these sections here on in between the two halves of the sprocket. Now, with the type of design of the T34 track, with that of those very large guide horns, those large triangular guide horns get locked into the spaces in between that of the rollers, which is what actually engages the track and lets it drive. It's a very unique system, and the T34 and the BT series were the only two tank designs that went to production that actually had this type of a feature. Of course, these date back to the Christie tank design, which of course the BT and the T34 were based on. Now on the Armortek T34, like I said before, the roller is that of a solid steel CNC machine piece, and it just pivots on the steel axle. Now, I believe on the real T34, these may or may not have been that of very large ball bearings. If anyone does know for certain, feel free to put that in the comment section listed below. Now, even though the stock sprocket is nicely engineered and has some basic, very decent overall detailing to it, for the purposes of this build, this sprocket here is going to have to be heavily revised. The reason why I say that is that this sprocket here represents that of a more earlier pattern of T34 sprocket. I want to say this is a 1940 pattern of sprocket. Now, since the tank I'm building is that of a T34-85, the sprocket design that we have here is not going to be accurate for a tank of that type of a pattern. These earlier 1940 parts are present on some of the features found on the Armortek kits, as when Armortek released the T34, they had two options available. You had a earlier T34-76 pattern, and then you of course had the T34-85 option. Even though the 85 option does have some 85 specific components, the tank does feature several 1940 pieces strewn into the build, and these do need to be corrected by the builder as he goes through the process. And these sprockets here are case in point of that. Now, as for the sprockets, where they're different on the two patterns has to do with the overall face detailing. First, the hubcap is very different compared to the later iterations. And also, so is the face detailing. The face on the earlier pattern T34 sprockets were very smooth. They had this type of inlet that we have here, integrally found on the sprocket. There was also, most notably, this pronounced ring that is found on both sides. Compare this to the later production T34 sprocket, and you can see how much the design was evolved from the original setup. Another earlier pattern detail has to do with that of the fasteners for that of the lugs for that of the track. The fasteners on the earlier pattern had this coned appearance to them. The purpose of this has to do with protecting them from any sort of damage from a stray bullet to shrapnel. This is a common type of feature found on military vehicles, and is definitely one found on many other tanks of the period, US, German, and I believe even British included. When the design was changed, you can see how the fasteners were also changed as well. Here we have the later pattern. First of all, the later pattern that we have here is a new component from EastCoastArmory.com. It is a 3D printed piece and has all of its detailing present. Now, the pieces are sold in a set where with one set you have enough to equip two sprockets, which of course is one whole T34. The pieces are designed to transform the face of the stock Armortek sprocket by dressing them up and having them look more like the later production units. On the later production units, we can see the difference with that of the center hub, how it's actually more pronounced compared to the earlier version. The entire hubcap itself has also been radically changed. Instead of this type of a system, we now have a domed flange type setup, which is basically similar to the rest of the tank's road wheel hubcaps. On this center, we now have rigidity spokes, which emerge outward. On the real T34, these sprockets were integrally casted, and all of these features would have been found on the castings, which warrants that for the rigidity ribs. On the holes, we now have, again, a pronounced step up, just like on the front idler wheels. And there's also a reinforcement brace, which connects it to that of the rim. Emerging from the spokes is to the locations where the fasteners for the roller lugs are now located. You can see that there's a platform in which the lugs mount to, and there's also this angled block that we have here on each of these pieces. The purpose of the angle block has to do now with the revised shape of the lug. Like we had before, the original lugs were coned in their outward appearance, and these were revised to the setup that we have here. The setup is that of basically a flattened type head that is machined down, and there is a straight section cut in. The purpose of this straight section is so when the locking lug goes in, it rests upon that surface, which prevents this piece from spinning and loosening when the tank is in operation. It also does a good job of retaining the piece in place firmly. Now, to convert the Armortek piece to the later pattern, like I said before, I went ahead and developed this bit of detailing. Now, the original intent for this piece is that you would use the center mounting fastener hole, which is found on the drive spindle of the sprocket shaft, which on the original tank would have been used to mount on the stock hubcap. This unit here, you would simply use it to hold on and mount on this large 3D printed piece to that of the Armortek wheel. In actuality, this could still be done. If anyone does have one of the Armortek kits and wants to upgrade the face of it, you can simply just drop this piece directly on, and you'll have the detailing ready to go. Now, there is a seam that you are going to see, and if you want to, you can remove this with some body work. But this is an option, a very quick and easy option to do for anyone that has one of the T34s and wants to upgrade their sprockets. If you notice, the material's also chosen by this on purpose. Rather than using resin, which I've done on several other builds in the past, because of the location that these are going to be mounted on, and also since the fact that the tank is radio controlled, a resin detail face is going to be haphazard for this type of an application. The 3D printing material is far more robust and rugged for this type of procedure compared to that of a resin counterpart, which is why I went ahead and used this material. Also, if you notice, the material I use is black instead of the standard white type 3D printed material, which is found on many other components. The reason for that has to do with, again, the purpose of this piece. This is going to be in a location where it will get scratched after prolonged use, simply due to, again, its job. It's going to be rolling on the track, and the track tends to pick up debris such as grass or sticks or twigs or pebbles or what have you. If the paint, or when the paint scratches, the black material showing through is going to be a lot better compared to something like a clean white piece or white material popping out through the paint, which can hurt the look. Black is a better medium for that type of, again, application. Now, like I said before, the original ECA kit is designed to just drop onto the sprocket, and you can see that the roller lug detailing is integrally printed. Now, on this model here, I went ahead and wanted to take it a step further from even my own detail insert. And that's what I've done to this sprocket over here. On this sprocket here, I went ahead and amputated out the rims that are found on the earlier pattern sprocket. These were turned down on the lathe. In addition to removing these out, you'll see that I went ahead and replaced the stock fasteners altogether with these new fabricated ones. The reason for that has to do with both their shape, but also has to do with their overall length. You'll notice that these ones here are longer compared to the stock ones, and because of the extra thickness of the detail insert, the stock ones are not going to fully mount on with enough threads to hold everything in place. So I went ahead and opted out for these longer fasteners. These fasteners were also modified from standard hex bolts to get the correct detailing for that of the T34 locking lug. Now, one of the reasons why I went with this was that this does make the piece a lot stronger with its mounting as opposed to the single fastener type design. And I feel that this is going to be more robust compared to, again, just the quick, easy installation like I mentioned before. Now, I will be adding some bodywork to this section over here, thus sealing and making the sprocket look like it's one integral piece. Now, if you notice on the back portion, I went ahead and drilled out small little inlets. The purpose for these inlets has to do with that of the fastener. With the nut screwed all the way in, you're not going to have as much of a protrusion of this fastener, which can lead to issues when the tank is driving, namely that of grass spooling up into this section over here, which can be an issue on radio controlled tanks. Now, I will be shortening the fasteners compared to the way you see them here, so they're even lower in profile from this piece. Now, because of the installation, the way this has to be installed is a little bit more trickier compared to a standard tank, in which you assemble the sprocket as one piece, prime it, paint it, and get it installed to the tank. With this has to be done in layers, due to the way the piece is mounted, and also due to the way the hubcap, or I should say the way the rollers need to be mounted on. The way this has to be done with the ECA insert with that of the center fastener is that once the taper brush lock gets fitted to the sprocket like this here, when the piece gets put on, you're not going to be able to get access to the taper brush lock. So the sprocket needs to be fitted to the tank first, then the lugs are added once the sprocket is on the spindle, and then finally everything gets sealed together with that of the fasteners, holding everything together in one piece. I'll be going over the installation of this in the video if this sounds pretty complicated. However, I will point out that the modification that I'm going to be doing to the sprocket here is something that should only be done with someone who has a lot of experience and the machine tools necessary to do this type of procedure. If you don't have a lathe or a belt sander or even a drill press, then this procedure is not for you and don't do it. It's better to leave the stock at sprock or to just mount the piece on like this with the simple installation than it is to go ahead and try to redo everything like I'm going to do for this video. First modification we're going to do is that of the removal of the ring that we have here integrally machined onto the sprocket surface. For this procedure, I'm going to be utilizing that of the lathe. Now, a belt sander can possibly be used in case a lathe is not on hand. However, the lathe, in my opinion, gives you a more machined type piece, and it is a more squared off piece compared to trying to do it by hand on a belt sander. The tool is lubricated, and I'm going to go ahead and just remove the ring. Once this is done, I'm going to flip the sprocket and remove the one on the opposite side. Needless to say, eye protection is going to be required by the user when doing this procedure. Alright, the ring has been deleted. Now I'm just going to go ahead and square it off a little bit further just to remove any residual evidence that the ring was there. And there we have it. One side down. I'm going to flip it and do the same procedure to the opposite side. after the rims are removed, I'm now going to go ahead and prep the sprocket face. Now, with the way the pieces are printed, we have the hubcap, which is suspended on those two little runner tabs that we have there, and there are also a few more runner tabs that need to be removed. The reason why these runner tabs are there is that when the pieces are first printed, they are printed side by side, interconnected with each other, so it's one printing necessary. You don't need two. As for the tabs, they're simply clipped away as you would on any other plastic model. And there's a little bit of a runner now on the inside, which also gets clipped away as well. Now, even once the pieces are clipped away, there are a little bit of burrs left over on both sides, and these need to be removed further. To do that, I'll be utilizing a Dremel with that of a high-speed cutting bit. And once plugged in, I'll be able to go ahead and remove these pieces. Now, once the rim is removed, you are going to have to adjust the shape here of the outside portion of the sprocket. This has to do with this rim that we have here. In order to make it fit flush with the sprocket, we do have to remove a little bit of material. This can only be done on the lathe, however, and cannot be done in any other way. It's also very important to point out that at this point here, orientation of the sprocket becomes absolutely important. Because of the taper brush lock, the sprocket only gets mounted in one way. It is non-reversible. As we can see here, the taper brush lock will not go on in the reverse way. This here is the front face of the sprocket and will only go in as such. Why this is important is that once you remove this material here, you'll be able to put the piece on. If you accidentally do it in reverse, it's going to be a problem, as it's going to basically hurt the look of the sprocket. Now again, saving grace is that this is on the inside portion of the tank and is not visible, but it is definitely something that could come and bite you, specifically with the procedure that I have to do after this when it comes time to boring out the holes on the reverse side. If you do this as a mirror image, you are going to have a bit of a problem. To prevent any confusion, I went ahead and labeled this section here front, so when it comes time for the machining, I know exactly how to put this in the lathe. With the wheel back in the lathe, I'm going to go ahead and start removing the required material. Now, if you look on the stock Armortek sprocket, there is a curved inclined section over here, and this is the section that needs to be squared off in order to fit on the replacement sprocket face. There's about a little less than 1/8 of an inch of material that needs to be removed in order to get the piece from this sloped appearance to the squared off appearance for that of the sprocket face. This, of course, has to be done on the lathe, and you really have no other choice to use it. Which is why I said before, if you do not have the required tools, you can either mount this piece directly onto the stock Armortek sprocket, or you can go ahead and just leave it with the early sprocket. The choice is really yours. And here you can see the machining now completed. And you can see how the shape has been adjusted. With this cut now added, the new sprocket face drops directly on, and it's flush with that of the Armortek sprocket. It's at this point now where I can start modifying the smaller holes for that of the fasteners. Now, in order to modify the sprocket for the replacement fasteners, I need to add bores in these sections over here of the rear side of the sprocket. The reason for this has to do again with the mounting nuts that I'm going to be using. These nuts, if mounted directly to the rear surface of the sprocket, are visually inhibiting in that they will be noticed and they will hurt the look of the model. But more importantly, because the tank is rail controlled, these are going to be snag points for dirt, debris, grass, and it's definitely something you want to keep to a minimum. In order to do this, you need to bore into the material. Now, when it comes to doing that, you don't want to go all the way through. Of course, if you bore the piece all the way through, the sprocket's basically ruined, and you're going to have to acquire another one from Armortek, which may not exactly be an affordable proposition. As for the drilling procedure, this is of course going to be done on a drill press, which ensures a nice flat drilling surface for a nice straight hole, and it also allows me to adjust the depth on the drill press so that, you know, the bit does not go anywhere past the desired depth. As for the depth, I'm looking to go at approximately about an eighth to a quarter of an inch into this material. Now, this material is very thick, and it's also a very strong medium, so you don't have to worry about the piece being weakened in any sort of a structural sense. You also don't want to drill it to the point where the fastener is completely flush with the surface. This is actually also not going to be beneficial when it comes time for the actual mounting of the fasteners. You still need to lock onto it with that of a tool of some sort in order to tighten the bolts. As for the bit I'm using, this bit is actually, again, larger than the nut required for the same purpose. It allows freedom for that of a wrench to get in there and tighten everything together. Now, oil has been added to the locations on the sprocket I'm going to drill out, and I'm going to start with the re-drilling procedure. And here's the sprocket with the holes now drilled out. Here I have one of the fasteners I'm going to be utilizing, and it drops directly in place. Now, if you notice, there is a little bit of the fastener protruding through the top. This is done on purpose. I could have went deeper with the boring out process, but by doing this, it's going to make it very difficult, if not impossible, trying to tighten these fasteners when it comes time for the installation of the sprocket lugs. By having just a little bit of the tool head emitting, this allows me plenty of grabbing space for that of a wrench in order so I could crank down and tighten the piece in place. After that, the sprocket at this point here is actually now ready for painting. It's going to get its coat of primer and its coat of base, coat of green, because once added to the tank, you're not going to be able to get access to these sections again for that of painting. It is at that point then when I could go ahead and start mounting on the now revised, or soon to be revised, ECA 3D printed detail face. After the sprocket is reworked, it's now time to rework that of the fasteners. Now for the fasteners, I'm going to be utilizing these bolts that I have here. The reason why I went with these fasteners is because they are the same shank diameter as the original Armortek units, which is very important because once the lugs are mounted, they are going to roll on this piece with no mods necessary, and of course this is very important as this is what actually engages the track. You don't want any fiddling or play going on with this part over here. Also, you notice that it's nice and smooth in this section here, which is exactly just like the original one. Again, you don't want to have it on the ribs as this can possibly lead to issues. In addition to the shank size, it's also longer compared to the original, which is why I'm not going to be utilizing the original bolts. However, this is just a starting point. In order to get it to look like and emulate the T34 units, I need to go ahead and modify them from this point here. This is going to involve three procedures. The first procedure is to round off the hex section here of the standard bolt. Then I need to adjust the height of the piece. And then third, I need to flatten off one of the now rounded edges. The last procedure will be actually shortening of the thread section of the fastener, but this will be done after the main shape revisions are completed. Now the first thing that I need to do is get this section as rounded as possible. Now the rest of it's going to be finished off on the lathe. However, to give the lathe a nice head start, on the bench grinder I'm going to go ahead and remove as many of the points on the hex as possible. Now one way to get the piece at a nice rounded shape that is basically symmetrical is by looking at the bottom portion here. On the inside here of the tool you'll see a raised section just before that of the points. You use this as a visual guide on the bench grinder when deleting these corners. This will give you a nice head start and a nice basic symmetrical round shape to which then the lathe can take it from there. This doesn't have to be exact, it just has to get you into a nice rounded smooth ballpark, which will then make the lathing procedure a lot simpler. And there we go. After the grinding is done, it is now time for that of the machine work. Now, the piece is on the lathe, as you can see, and I'm going to go ahead and do two things. First procedure is to refine and streamline the sides, make it nice and symmetrical. And after that, it's then time to adjust the height. As for the height, I'm going to cut it roughly in half compared to the way you see it here. In addition to cutting it in half, there's also going to be a little bit of a nub that is going to protrude from the face of the piece. This is as per the real unit. Okay, the tool is now lubricated, and I'm going to go ahead and start with the cutting. And here's the piece now fully machined. You can see that the transformation is almost complete and how much it has changed from the simple rounded off bolt fastener that we had before. What's next is to square off one side of the section to complete the transformation for that of a T34 locking lug. And with what is the bench grinder in the background spinning down, you can see that the flat has been added. To do the flat, I simply just ground this section down on the bench grinder from before. The piece is now complete, and it's off to do the same procedure to the rest of the required fasteners. Once all the fasteners are revised, it is then time to modify my 3D printed face. Now, like I said before, originally I was actually going to just simply use one single fastener and bolt everything together in that manner. But I went ahead and switched out the design to the way you see it here. To do this conversion to my own piece, I'm going to drill out all these sections here on the drill press, and then I'm going to remove the little integrally printed shelf that is that of the detail piece, delete that with a Dremel, making it with the format that you see here. Now when I delete it, I'm not going to delete it entirely, as I do want to keep the integral printed block as it's necessary for that of the detailing, and that's kind of the reason why we have this little flat machined in, so that it sits in that little slot there and locks it in place. And here are all the components for one rework sprocket, now fully painted and are ready for assembly. From the last scene, the sprocket itself has been primed and painted. Now if you notice, this side is red while this side is green. This is the back portion, and this is the portion that's actually going to be more visible, as this is going to be covered up with that of the 3D printed detail face. The taper brush lock equipment is over here. This is what's going to mount the sprocket to the spindle. These are, again, standard for Armortek models and work very well. Of course, we have a square key, which will lock everything in place, and two grub fasteners, which are used to actuate the taper brush lock. We have here the fasteners that are going to be used for the rollers. As for the rollers, these are, again, are the kit supply ones, but have been painted. and primed as well. Now, if you notice, I went ahead and removed the paint from these two sections over here. These need to be like a bearing surface and need to be nice and slick so they could freely spin inside of the recesses here of the sprocket. When it comes time for installation, I'm going to be adding some lubricant, which I'll be showing during the installation scene. So more info on that is to come. Here we have a secondary locking fastener with a washer, which will be used to fasten to the center portion, and then the hub detailing, which has also been primed, will be used to cap it all off. And here's the main drive spindle with its masking tape removed. As if we can quickly recall, I masked this area up before the lower hull went to its prime and base coat in order to prevent any paint from getting on the surface. The first thing to do is going to be installation of the actual sprocket itself, and that will entail first that of the taper brush lock. I like to line up the taper brush lock. So we have the 3 holes here. There are 3 holes that are integrally milled into the sprocket surface, and there's corresponding ones matching on the lock itself. This is par for the course for all Armortek builds. Now, to make sure it's fully seated, a couple taps, light taps with a hammer, gets the piece firmly in place. Now, of course, a rubber mallet could also be used in its place, but a hammer will also be suffice, as what was clearly just seen. The sprocket then gets slid onto the main axle, and you want to get the 2 key locations lined up on both the spindle and the taper brush lock. Once the wheel is positioned, one thing that has to be kept in mind is the orientation of where the sprocket lies on the main shaft. This is extremely crucial, as you need to have the teeth line up with the grooves on the road wheels. If there is any sort of off-centering, this can lead to a track derailment, which again is not something that you want to have in field. On this model here, I was able to get the wheel all the way up to the final drive housing, which gives me the adequate clearance. It's now time to add on the key, which will lock it in place just prior to that of adding on the locking fasteners for the brush lock. Now it's time to install the key. Now the key, of course, is a very important part, as this is what locks the wheel to the spindle and is what gives you the actual spin that propels the track. As for the key, it just slides in place. You first line it up, and then with a hammer or a rubber mallet, you just tap it until it's firmly and fully seated. Once the key is mounted, the wheel and the axle are now one piece. It is now time to secure the taper brush lock fasteners that will clamp the piece firmly and fully to the axle. As for the fasteners, the brush lock supplies you with these 2 long grub screws. I'm going to add a drop of, or I should say in this case a smear of some blue Loctite, and start threading on these pieces. Everything is pre-threaded, and they should just simply thread on into their appropriate locations. Now, before tightening all the way, I stop, and I'm going to add the fastener now to the opposite side. Same procedure. I lock it onto the Allen wrench, add my smear of blue Loctite, and begin to thread away. Now there are only 2 fasteners which are needed for the brush lock. The 3rd hole that you see here is actually a removal hole and is not one that you need to worry about for the installation. Okay, once the bolt is now on, we can now torque down onto the piece. Which will now keep the sprocket from moving in a lateral motion, which is definitely not something that you want to have on a radio control tank. By the way, if you go through this procedure and the sprocket still has any lateral movement to it, you need to stop and redo the installation, as you made a mistake somewhere during the install. As for this sprocket here, it is now ready for that of the detail face. Now, prior to adding the detail face, all of these procedures here are basically stock from the Armortek kit. It is at this point here is where we're going to go off the track in order to put on the new detail faceplate. Now, to temporarily hold the detail faceplate to the sprocket, I'm going to add some silicone to the inside portion. Of the sprocket in this location over here. Now, with the silicone, this is not a permanent type of a application, like with a certain type of epoxies or glues. And this should be more than suffice at holding the piece onto the model, but also it is a removable type of a application, so if in case the sprocket ever has to be removed, you can just simply undo the bolts and pop the component off. Now that the piece is basically tacked on, I can now, with two hands, freely install the rollers, which will again not only hold the rollers in place, but also sandwich the detail piece to the rest of the sprocket. With the face now on, it's now time to add the rollers. As for the rollers, they are ready to go at this point. The fastener has been shortened from its original height just prior to the filming of this scene. And as for the roller, like I said before, the area over here is bare steel. The reason why I don't have any paint on here, as this needs to be a nice slick bearing type surface so that this could freely roll inside of the sprocket during the tank's operation. This is critical that this rolls and doesn't get snagged or hung up, as if the piece gets, since with the way the tank runs, the roller does need to pivot and swing. If not, you can cause wear to not only the steel but also to the track itself, which is something that can lead to problems. Now, because the piece is bare steel, it may be susceptible to that of corrosion and rust. In order to prevent this, I am going to add some lubrication with that of grease on these two bearing surfaces that I have here and here. These should be enough to keep the piece nice and clean and preventing it from any sort of surface type rust for a good long while. However, I do recommend that after or as the tank ages, whoever owns this model down the road, keep aware of these rollers, as if you don't physically check them and if you see that they're getting snagged, a little drop of oil might be something that is beneficial. Now, in addition, of course, of the grease being used to protect the steel, it's also, of course, a lubricant which will help the piece spin a lot more freely once mounted. Now, the grease is added to not just the roller, but also to the bearing slick section here of the mounting fastener. Just a small little swipe. That's all that's needed. And these pieces are now ready for installation. Now, one advantage about the T34's design, and is actually what makes a contributing factor that makes this modification doable and feasible, is the access that the operator or the builder has to this rear section here of the sprocket. With this access, this makes the installation of these pieces actually a breeze to install. Now, as for the install, I'm going to start with the roller. I'm going to line it up to where it needs to be. And then with the other hand, I'm lining in the fastener. The fastener simply slides directly in place as it would on the real T34. Wipe away any extra grease that we don't need here. And it's now ready for its mounting fastener. I have the nut here in my hand, and first I'm going to make sure that there's no little bit of grease residue on the fastener threads itself. Once I know that's nice and clean, with some blue Loctite, I'm going to add a smear on the threads, and I'm just going to simply thread it on. Now, once the fastener is at a certain point, I'm not going to tighten it at this point just yet, as I'm going to rotate the sprocket to the opposite side and get the roller on the opposite side installed as well. Once I do that, this will prevent the 3D printed part from yawing or bending. As for the installation, this is simply just repeat. Once the second unit is mounted in the same way, you just simply repeat the exact same steps for the remainder of the bolts. Once all the bolts are basically in place, you can just simply tighten them up. Now, with the last roller being mounted, you get an opportunity to see how the fastener face interacts with that of the 3D printed detail rim. And it locks in place just as it would on the real T34. You can see that with that little flat added and that corresponding brace that is found on the rim here of the sprocket, once it is fitted in place, it does prevent the fastener from rotating on you. And once the fasteners are all tightened, the rollers are all done and the sprocket's basically just about finished. Here you can see the rollers mounted on the now completed rework sprocket. They have their nice little spinning to them, which is definitely going to come to aid when it comes time for the track when it gets mounted. Now all that remains now is to add the center locking fastener and mount on the detail hub. As for that, that is done again with that smaller fastener and a washer. Some Loctite. And I'm just going to now thread the guy in place. Now you don't want to over torque on this. This is just, you just want to have enough pressure just to hold onto and crimp onto the detail face. There we have it. The last bit of detailing that gets added is that of the hubcap, and this is going to be held on with that of just some silicone. By the way, it's also important to point out that the sprocket installation gets done before the installation of the motors. Once the installation of the motors are done, you're not going to be able to freely spin the sprocket, which of course is going to come to effect when it comes time for mounting on that of the rollers. And let the silicone now do its thing. The final procedure that was made to the rear sprocket had to do with the seam line that's present from the main sprocket machining to that of the new printing that was affixed to the front portion of the sprocket. This seam here was thoroughly polished and deleted with that of the bodywork, and because the wheel is dimensionally the exact same size of the sprocket, there shouldn't be any sort of ridges or any sort of rises found on the two pieces where they make contact with each other. And with everything done, it should make for a nice seamless appearance. With the completion and installation of the rear sprockets, along with the other modifications that were made to the suspension that were discussed in the last video, the tank is really starting to flesh out and have the appearance of that of a later pattern T34-85. From this point on, the model can now get its tracks assembled and fitted, along with the installation of the tank's motors and some of the machinery. All this is going to be discussed in the next video update, along with more than likely that of a test drive. But of course, more information on this is to follow. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek T34-85 tank. If you like this video, stop by and like us on Facebook, where there are more photographs of this particular build that have been posted since the project start, along with the other projects and builds that have been posted on the ECA channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com, where there are more builds, along with 1/6 and 1/16 scale detail components. Thanks for watching.